A warm welcome, everyone. My name is Alok Choudhary. I'm professor and head of supply chain research group at Warwick University. I think I will start with introducing the panel. So I'm offering to Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Campbell. I look after the supply chain for Pepsico in Europe. So that's our food and beverage business across the geography of Europe.
Dunc.
Good morning, Dunc Lowe, Chief Supply Chain Officer for Campari Group. So any of you in the bar last night, there was a fair few drinks of mine being consumed, but look after end-to-end supply chain globally.
Yeah, last night, actually, literally everyone's trying to follow Dunc.
I know, I picked up the bar bill.
I'm David Pettet, not Chris Pettet. I just thought I'd clarify that straight away. I'm the Global Human Rights and Sustainable Supply Chain Director at Reckitt. For those who don't know who Reckitt is, we have a whole range of health, hygiene, and nutrition products, such as Durex, Dettol, Strepsils, etc. Glad to be here today.
Rob.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Rob Scholte. I'm a supply chain officer for Weston. We make French fries. I have the challenge to summarize my career, 35 years, in one sentence, and this is about it. Thank you for now.
Excellent. I think if you summarize that in 35 years, it would be Guinness Book of World Records. But anyway, I would like to start with this discussion around, what's happening in supply chain across the globe over the last few years. And I believe that when I talk to, supply chain managers and leaders and CSOs like you, a lot of those at the moment, I think the discussion has been hijacked by resilience than sustainability. It was there a few years ago. It's coming up. But what we believe is that the next normal supply chain, we have added 2 more KPIs to the already existing list of KPIs around cost, quality, and service. So those 2 are additional, sustainability and resilience. And this session, we are going to very much focus on sustainability. So to start with, I think the point, when we talk about sustainability, there is quite a lot of words that's there. But one word that is very common among industries around ESG sustainability, environmental, social, and governance-related sustainability. There are a lot of debate going on, whether that's the appropriate one or not, but not going onto the debate, but going into the understanding in research, particularly, we believe in evidence. So as a researcher, I look for, thousands of data points and come up with evidence. And the evidence suggests that basically your ESG sustainability creates value for your firm. That could be in the form of your financial performance. That could be in the form of, creating innovation. That could be in the form of reducing waste. Whole range of benefits one can derive from. But the most important thing is to understand from investment perspective. I mean, if you look at the global investment, 53 trillion of the world's 53 trillion out of 140 trillion investment is geared towards ESG. And that's 1/3 of the funds. And also it is important to understand that how different firms, and I will use examples like Patagonia, we have Apple, for example, you have even company like McDonald's, number of firms, what they are recently been doing, linking their executive bonuses to the ESG performance of the firm. And that's kind of next step. So the point I would like to kind of gear towards that if not managed properly, in today's environment, ESG creates risk for you. There was a time when people used to talk about how ESG sustainability basically creates competitive advantage. I think we are just passing that time. It's not really for creating a competitive advantage, but it's much more than that. So we reached to a point where a lot of challenges in sustainability, and I would like to pick some of those today in today's discussion. I would very much like to welcome you to ask any questions and challenge our panels. But the first one that I would like to start with, and I will start with Rob, is around ESG for whom? When you talk about different groups of stakeholders, you have got your customers, your suppliers, your employees, your investors, your shareholders, activist groups, right? And this creates a confusion in the mind of people that when you think of ESG, yesterday our sponsor Coupa, they presented a survey and we were talking about the context of US and EU. And in the US, their survey suggested that it's very much focused toward EDI and social side, On the other hand, in the EU, it's very much focused on environmental side. So that's another kind of divergence, environmental, social, and governance-related issues. So the question I would like to start with is, how do you go about balancing those priorities for different groups of stakeholders, and for them, ESG mean different things? How do you go about balancing those priorities?
Yeah, thanks for bringing the question. In our case, I told you we make French fries. We basically process potatoes. And processing potatoes to French fries means that we have those various stakeholders, but it starts with agriculture, it starts with farmers. It starts with farmers that have regulations, that have changing environments, nitrate, fertilizers, pollution, carbon dioxide, all the things that go at a farmer right now. Many of them are very uncertain about their personal future in the space where we harvest our potatoes. And we have a very intense relationship with all of them. So that certainly is one stakeholder. I think the word balancing means is that if we would want to balance the needs from a consumer, which is our final end target, obviously, or our customer, who's in between in the supply chain, or the external environment, being the broad audience of the public, yeah, the activists, the NGOs, or internally our shareholders from a financing perspective, their needs, they go wild. They don't match. So what we do internally is we don't try to run after all of them. Of course, we'd like to be compliant, but what we need to do is set our own agenda in terms of doing what we feel is right for us and for the planet. And being authentic about exactly that is more important to us than trying to hit all the specific requirements from all the stakeholders, because it's virtually impossible. So for us, we're driving our own agenda, and we want to be ahead of the game. Not always easy, but we're trying hard.
Excellent. Anything you have to add?
Yeah, no, I think just building on what Rob mentioned, and this is how we tackle it in Reckitt, we've got what we refer to internally as our shields. So, we know, to meet the bare essentials for all the shareholders and stakeholders that we have, we must do X, Y, Z. And it's important that you have those firm foundations in place. But then in terms of focusing on those areas of sustainability that really drives brand differentiation or opportunities to really make a positive impact, we will not do it everywhere. We will identify those areas where, given the nature of our business and brands, we're best placed in order to drive impact. So if you're looking at Dettol, we have an intrinsically important role to play around sanitation. That would be a key priority that we will go above and beyond. If we look at Durex condoms, we have a huge role to play around sexual health and rights. So that's where we've also made sure, in terms of our strategy and how we communicate with shareholders and stakeholders, that we're not going to meet all of their needs. We will do the basic and then identify those opportunities where we go above and beyond.
Thank you.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what's been said about you have to chart your own path here rather than reacting to the external environment too much. However, it does have to be centered on, effectively what is going to make a difference. So internal to PepsiCo, we launched a strategy 12 months ago, and the strategy is a sustainable strategy. It's not. We have a business strategy and we need to bolt sustainability onto the back end of it. It's the core of what we're trying to achieve, rather than being an add-on. And it starts with, similar to Rob, it starts with agriculture. We're a big agricultural business. So, the communities and the farms through to the consumers at the end. But it's about the brands. The brands have got to have a story that makes sense. You can't have a business that's trying to be one thing and its brands are something else. So the whole message around what it is we're trying to create as an organization in the long term, it's integral to the brands, and the sustainability journey is integral to supporting those brands. So I think that's fundamental. The other thing that plays out really strongly here is you do have to be conscious of which stakeholders are going to play in which space as well. So I like the use of the word shields. You do, though, have to, whilst I say chart your own path, That doesn't mean you ignore the stakeholders. You may not follow them, you may not respond to them, but you have to be aware of what's happening. What are they talking about? You know, being conscious of what's happening in the world around you, you know, because that might be the next big risk that comes along. And if you choose to ignore it, it could catch you out. So I think you have to continue to sort of scan the environment to check, you know, where the mood music is going, so that at least you know how you can center your strategy against those other challenges. So I think it has to be a holistic plan rather than, as I said earlier, a separate strategy for driving ESG. It has to be integral to your business.
I think, just rather than repeating what many of my colleagues have said, the most important thing for me is you mustn't be frightened by an ESG agenda, and you mustn't be frightened by any of those stakeholders in there. And it's okay to be one of three things. It's okay to be a leader. So you know, you can skim through LinkedIn and you'll see other people who are posting things every few weeks, you know, from businesses. And I know if you go and look under the surface, there's some good things there, but it's not really changing the world. You can be a mass follower, which most people are, or you can be a lagger. And any one of those three is fine, provided you consciously choose it. It's okay to be a lagger. I mean, I'll be honest with you, my business 3 years ago, you know, my job was to keep people out of jail. I wasn't thinking about saving the planet, but that's a conscious decision. You know, the time when the thought process was consumers are going to drive ESG, it's gone. Consumers aren't driving ESG. You know, you go and ask a consumer what they think, they'll tell you they're really worried about the environmental consequences. You ask them to pay some more, they don't choose the product. I mean, there is some choice in some categories, but generally speaking, it's not now consumers that are particularly driving the agenda. It's becoming much more governmental regulation, and eventually that will drive businesses. Therefore, you know, you can, you know, I'm sure my colleagues will tell you later. I mean, you could spend a fortune on ESG and have no returns. So I know when you say you drive value, you may protect the business. You might be a shield that protects the business from going out of business. But, you know, investing in ESG at the moment is a very expensive pastime.
Okay. I think previous to my question, there is another linked question I have, which relates to the reporting and disclosure of ESG. And I just remember, you know, few months ago, Elon Musk gone mad because his company was thrown out of S&P 500 index, you know, and for a genuine reason. So, of course, there are a lot of data providers. S&P 500 is one of them. You have Dow Jones. You have got a number of companies like technical. I'm not going to name them, but there are a number of companies, and they capture different things, right? So that's another. How do you think if that's add value, or is that a hindrance in terms of when you go about reporting and meeting the needs of these data providers who are going to disclose about your business, including carbon disclosure projects and so on? How do you see that, whether it's a hindrance or if that adds value?
Well, personally, I would see that as a necessity, something we do. And we try to do it well, obviously. But for me, reporting in, let me call it, annual type of reports is something that I would bring to the hygiene level. What we do in terms of active communication to our stakeholders is far more important and far more specific and far more customized than generalized reporting. In our case, and I'll give you another example, in our case, our factories, and we've got about 24 globally, they're being audited by customers typically every second week. Yeah, so 25 orders typically per factory. For them, being compliant and being sometimes ahead of the game is more important than what we actually write in the annual report. But we'll do that, it's hygiene.
Yeah, I'd agree that a lot of that is a hygiene factor. I think, though, you have to also see it as being, you know, the 3 or 4 organizations that you might choose to report through, whether it be the Ellen MacArthur Foundation or, you know, the Sustainability Index. You know, you have to use it reactively rather than put a big banner up saying, aren't we wonderful, because it's more, look, we've got some external validation. If you get to a position, as Dunc referenced, when you might be in trouble, you can say, look, this is some external evidence that we're doing the right stuff. So I think it's necessary for that. I think the other thing, again, referencing what you mentioned, Dunc, is the pressure from governments is increasing. So, you know, hundreds of companies in the next 12 months are going to have to report a lot more data than they have historically through the EU's directive. It's requiring people, it's the license to operate, and they're going to have to report. Now, that's a big change for many organizations. So it doesn't become a choice anymore. It becomes, a license to operate. And the challenge with that is many of these things are competing. I mean, managing an ESG environment is like managing a balloon. You push in somewhere and something else comes out. Are we managing carbon footprint here? Are we managing, water usage? Because they can often drive the agenda in a different way. So the reporting helps you provide some structure, but it shouldn't be seen as the banner to wave.
And I think, if I may, I think it depends who you speak to. I was at a conference at Coca-Cola's offices in Atlanta last year, and we had someone from the UN, they remain nameless, where we had a panel discussion exactly about the value of reporting and the future of reporting. And he said, absolute waste of time. I don't agree with him. I think I'm a bit of a halfway house here. I see the value because particularly for companies that have a sort of compliance-only agenda, reporting and having more obligations on companies to report can help open up the door for discussion with your exec around how shareholders are perceiving your company and how they rely on these sort of indices in order to make investment decisions. So I think that does help sort of open up that dialogue and discussion to push things forward. But I think there's also an element of how can you be selective on who you proactively engage with around reporting. Because otherwise you spend your entire year filling in reports, and we can all get very good at filling in reports, but actually doing very little on the ground to actually drive the change needed.
I think some form of reporting is now becoming a necessity. I mean, for example, my business Campari joined CDP 2 years ago. So having gone from, let's say a compliance-driven structure, as you were saying, to much more of a more forward-looking sustainability journey. We joined CDP because investors were starting to come to the CEO and during the quarterly results, asking what our metrics were, because we didn't have anything. So almost reporting became a necessity, which then led to direct share price and shareholder impact. So we've seen a significant improvement in share price directly because of the reporting structure that we've done. Now, has it, I don't necessarily think we see step changed in the activities that we're doing, particularly in environment. We were always internally doing a lot of things, driving water and energy, as Paul said. But the reporting, which might be more mechanistic to some degree, has had an impact on share price. So it's becoming critically important.
Thank you. I think I would take this conversation forward with whatever is happening around the world in the last couple of years. Going back to risk and resilience a little bit. So I'm trying to understand two things from those perspectives, so that in the context of supply chain, you have got your suppliers, their suppliers, different tiers of suppliers, and a majority of the risk, and that's been quoted around 80% of your risk that you see is coming from your second to third tier suppliers. And same is also very much true for carbon emission, is that your majority of your emission, your scope 3 emission, is coming from your tier 2 and beyond the suppliers there. So in that context, what would you suggest, Dunc, the role of collaboration in engaging with suppliers and working with them?
I think the last 2 years have shown anybody certainly on the procurement side of supply chain, how difficult the supply challenges have been. But again, I think people became a bit too much focused on being frightened by some of the events that were taking place and rushed to some degree to make business continuity decisions that I think on hindsight they probably changed. A lot of near sourcing has now gone back to outsourcing. And it's more about, are you just doing some basic fundamental assessment of your key supplier portfolio, looking at where you make. I had one cap that was made. We make a product called Sky Vodka, and Sky Vodka is produced in the US, but the cap is produced. One part was in Ukraine, but I didn't know. So one part's in Ukraine, one part's then made in Italy. It's all sent together and sent to the US. So obviously, when the war broke out, somebody came and said, we've got to a plant on the border with, probably like yourself, on the border with Russia, what do? Well, they just moved it to Indonesia. So I've gone from Ukraine to Indonesia. The issue was still you're making a component on the far side of the world, bringing a component somewhere else. If you've got inventory policies, modeling, you can make any of these supply chains work effectively. You can still go to the lowest cost supply chain. And really, for me, it's not so much about the absolute collaboration with suppliers, because you need to have a good working relationship with suppliers, but you also need to have a good, robust relationship with suppliers. But it's about looking at, have you looked at your business continuity plans for your key products, and have you got sufficient backup, either in inventory modeling or in multiple sourcing, to make it work? And personally, I'm not worried about where the components are made across the world. So the resilience element of the last 2 years was frightening at times, but is now almost winding back to where it was in 2019. So I think, it's almost, I'm not saying it's status quo where we were 2019, but it's not far back to where we were in 2019. And therefore, the same type of thought process you were doing then are now. I don't think the world is not more volatile today than it was in 2019. We've been through periods of increased volatility, but it's now dying down again to the same type of volatility it was before. I don't know.
I think, Alok, if I may add to that, collaboration is key, particularly around the sustainability agenda. As you said, most of our impacts are outside of our own operations, outside of our factory gates. And most of the challenges we as sort of businesses face are common. If you're looking at human rights abuses, if you're looking at climate change, water scarcity. So I know collaboration, particularly between peer companies and suppliers, sometimes may be a bit of a dirty world. I think, there historically has been a need to drive healthy competition between companies. But certainly within the sustainability agenda, I think working together with peers to address some of those challenges is the best way to drive that change in a cost-effective way. The key thing to look at, though, is how do you create an enabling environment for that? And core to that is your procurement practices. How do you move away the procurement dialogue from just focusing on cost, service, and quality to capturing the wider ESG agenda? Because for some of our suppliers, even at tier 1 level, for them to invest in decarbonising their operations or putting renewables has cost. Investments with 4 or 5 year paybacks. If you're only giving them a 1-year contract with no monthly volume commitments, there's no incentive for them to actually do that because they just don't know whether they have business with you in future. So I think that combination of reviewing the indirect impacts of your procurement practices to create a win-win enabling environment, coupled with greater peer collaboration, so there is a greater ask from suppliers and their customers around this agenda, I think is key.
Thank you.
I'd like to add a different perspective, because I may mildly disagree with the point that Dunc just made. But that may also be because my environment is very different, to be very honest. Our environment, my environment, is hugely more volatile than it was 4 or 5 years ago. Now, let me just give you 2 examples. One example is the legislation. If I look at legislation and the way governments act, I would say it's not predictable. Yeah? I'd love to say that the governments in the legislative environments that I operate in, the governments understand what legislation needs to be. Yeah? I think in reality, politicians are typically struggling to follow and set their own direction. There is quite a lot of debate about where we're going and how we're going to do this, and there's lots of interpretation questions. So I feel the political environment is a lot more volatile. The other thing that matters to me quite a lot is the whole farming practice. Yeah, if you think about what a farmer needs to go through in today's environment, it's quite different. Yeah? I'm in a lucky space in the sense that we've developed relationship for my business with our farmers over many, many, many years. But their practice is under pressure because of legislation, because of weather conditions changing. Last year was a bad potato year because of drought in summertime. Yeah? So I'm working with our farmers to develop new varieties, but variety development on the potato front is typically a 5 to 10 year program. So what we do today will only impact new varieties that are more drought resistant or need less herbicides or need less fertilizer. These are things that take a long time. And what they require on the legislative side is stability, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're experiencing today. So we're under stress. Not we as a company, but the whole environment is not easy. That's my interpretation of reality.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob.
I think there's something where these things come together, particularly around the peer collaboration and the legislative framework. I think we're all guilty of resisting the legislation that's coming, but resisting the bits that we don't like and supporting the bits we do like, rather than, I think, as peer companies stepping back and saying, the legislation's coming, how do we make sure it's framed up to get to the right outcome? And if a peer company's got a better view on what this legislation should be, let's just suck it up and get on with it. Rather than, no, I'm going to be competitively disadvantaged in this tiny area, so I'm going to resist everything. I think it's incumbent on industry to come together to try and drive some common views and then work with the legislative bodies, whether it be the EU or individual countries, to then drive sensible outcomes. Part of the issue for the governments is we all come with our own agenda and we say no to everything. As soon as you flip that into yes, but, or yes, and, you can start to influence exactly what the outcome is in a constructive way. But it requires us as organizations to get our act together. The one that always hits me is third-party logistics. We all use them, but we all have a different requirement from them in terms of how they comply. So if you look at the providers, they're able to stand back and just wait because they don't know what we need, because I need something. I move light materials around, bags of crisps or heavy in bottles, but I can only move them over relatively short distances versus a much more dense product at times, but also, similar. You've got the same problem as I've got. It's large volume of water you're moving around in potatoes, but we're not able to get our heads around what is it we need from the third-party logistics providers to make sure that there's structural investments that drive that agenda going forward, so that we're not actually taking control of our own destiny. We're resisting the change. And that, for me, is one of the big bits of collaboration we need to get our heads around.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I think at this stage, I'll take a break and give some time for audience to ask any question, any burning question that you may have. And if you want any particular panel member to answer that. Any question from audience? Yep. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you very much, panel. Okay, when I look at sustainability, ESG, stuff like that, I'm kind of looking at, think about your company in the next 5-10 years, and think of the people, because we might be retired then, think of the next generation coming behind, because the ESG is the key to them. My daughter got a job during COVID, and she had 3 job offers. And that's what made the difference. The next generation that are going to be filling the posts today, tomorrow, their mindset is different, and that's a challenge. And we're not prepared. We kind of look at numbers and adjustment, but the people who are going to deliver the next 5 years goals and objectives and stuff like that, I think we need to capture their needs, and that's where we have like diversity, inclusion, and stuff like that, which I think are pretty key. But it's kind of silent today, and we don't talk about it. And I think we need to kind of discuss that. And it'll be good for you guys within your company to kind of help maybe explain how you're navigating this kind of headache or concern. Thanks.
Okay.
I could probably just 30 seconds on responding to that. I think it's fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental that the point I made earlier around it's part of our integral to the strategy, it's not an add-on. And that includes exactly what it means to the people that are going to be employed in the next 10, 15 years. It's the first thing that people talk about when I interview them for a role is, okay, so what's your view on this? What's the company's view? Integral to this Pepsi Positive strategy that we have is what is the employee value proposition? So what does it mean? Now, we're a big polluter. Hands up, we make plastic, servings in plastic containers, which is not great. But we are able to talk to people about the fact that the changes we make can change the industry. So in the UK, we've moved to 100% recycled plastic in all of our beverages. That's a difficult step to make. But by doing that, we are able to convert the industry because we start to drive the change. It'd be very easy for me to say, well, don't join us then because you can look at one lens and say that we pollute, rather than you can join us and help change the system and have a much bigger impact. That can be a great selling story, for one, but actually it's the right thing to do as well. So it's not just a bit of marketing, but it appeals to people that they can see organizations that have the maturity to accept what they're not doing well at. What are they doing about it? And is there a meaningful agenda that you're working towards? And I think it's about being honest, not just with prospective employees. All the conversation we've had so far, you've got to be open and transparent, whether it be with peer companies, whether it be with suppliers, whether it be with governments, whether it be with other stakeholders. That transparency is really important. But you've got to have a story to tell that's real and meaningful. That will appeal to people who are going to join your organization in the future.
I think the balance is shifting, for sure. I mean, I can only speak for my own organisation, and that, as Paul said, the EVP, used to be about some, standard metrics that people would look for, when you're joining a business, whether it's compensation, benefits, But now, I wouldn't say every interview with every 23-year-old is talking about this, what's your sustainability agenda, but I'd be surprised by the number of younger people coming knowing the background to the business. And therefore, we've had to pivot a little bit to feel okay about selling what we're doing. We don't do a lot of internal sell. So we've created, as part of the EVP, a piece on sustainability to demonstrate the great things that we are doing. And whilst it's not, I wouldn't say it's attracting people in, it's almost the bare minimum that gets you through the hurdle, to show people joining. I mean, just for an example, my head of global sustainability is 27. And that's not a surprise. The talent coming from universities in this area tends to be, the younger people who've been specialising in this area over the last few years. I think that, I don't think you need to be, again, it's a bit, you don't need to be too worried about it. It's about providing a hurdle and a bare minimum that it's not a distraction for joining your business, rather than you thinking it's a real draw.
Thank you. Anything to add? No. Any more questions? I think yeah.
Thanks. So one of the things that's been mentioned before, Duncan, you just mentioned it.
Thank you. You've got a head of global sustainability. Reckitt, you're in a position where you're looking after sustainability. How are you integrating this into your supply chain organisation?
So, from a Reckitt perspective, there is value in having a sustainability centre of excellence separate from the procurement function or the supply function, because we act at times as the sort of business conscience. Where there are difficult decisions to be made, there is a level of impartiality that helps challenge the exec. However, we do need to work hand in glove with the supply function. So a few practical things that we do. We have, I have monthly connects with our CPO and the supply leadership team. I'm a permanent member on our health global supply leadership team. So I'm already at that sort of senior management level discussions. I'm there making sure sustainability is represented and then integrated into business plans. And then what we do is each year we create an enabling environment to support the delivery of our targets. So we have clear objectives that are incorporated into the long-term incentive plans of our executive team to support the decarbonisation of our operations. We're integrating more operational metrics around the whole ESG agenda in our procurement team objectives as well. And then we're also integrating ESG into just how procurement buys. So we've integrated sustainability into the vulnerability tools, the commodity plans. So there's a whole host of stuff you can do at a strategic management representation level, but also an operational level that helps really embed sustainability.
Thank you.
I can add to it. In my particular case, I've got 4 people in my organization that have a header of sustainability in their title, because that's the only thing they do. But what they do is a little bit to what David just said, is coordinating, communicating, making sure we sense and hear what's going on in the marketplace. Yeah. What I'm doing, because sustainability reports to me, is I'm actually driving all the decision taking through the functional lines, because that's where the difference needs to be made. So take an example. I've got a big engineering group. the engineering group has a function in there, and it's called engineering by design. So we try to build sustainability in the design of our equipment, and I'm driving that in the line. So if you ask me where I put pressure in the line organization. The sustainability team, the very small team, is helping me to coordinate and to communicate. But if it's not in the line, won't work.
Great, thank you.
I think there's no right answer. I think both can work. I personally, I have it as a standalone function within supply chain, because for me, when it was originally lost within the functions, but I think that could be scale of organisation as well. So I've got it as a standalone piece where we drive through the board long-term incentives on that, and that group of people is then driving the activities through the organisation. But I can see how it works in both ways.
Yeah. Any last thought?
I would just echo. I think it can work either way. It can be, depending on where you are on the evolution of the agenda, where it best sits. Within our organisation, it sits separately. It sits because it reports directly into the global head of the organisation, because we see it as being, it's needed that impetus to bring the brands to the fore, rather than it be buried in a supply chain area where basically it's about, make and move. It's much broader than that, because that's the stage we're at. It's very different depending on the organisation's evolution, I think. So I agree. Horses for courses. But you need to be intentional. You absolutely need to be making the decision about where it is for a reason, rather than, ooh, who could look after this? And just park it somewhere and hope they do a good job.
Any last question from the audience? Yeah. Go ahead.
Question to you, Anand. As an academic, there's a lot of commitments to the longer-term, net zero campaigns, 2040, 2050. What do you rate the chances of success, and if so, have you simulated it, to achieve these targets in the future?
I think, the way things are happening yesterday only, you have got the announcement made by European Commission President talking about the new Green Deal Act. And I think there is a lot happening in that space. A lot is governed by, you have got TCFD, you have got UK government that is currently debating on enforcing these regulations around a Scope 3 emission. We have gone back the time when in 2008 we have these regulations. So these are kind of coming as a market force. There are companies who are doing it by themselves to, again, attract investors, to attract their shareholders, their different group of stakeholders. But then there is this market force where, if you think of the UK, for example, one of the great things UK is kind of known globally is its aspiration around net zero, and that is there was an estimate conducted by KPMG, and it said UK is the number two in terms of the list of companies who are committed to net zero. Now, if UK want to maintain that position, they need to be able to act. The policymakers needs to act on those levels, and that is what kind of forcing the regulations and act. So if you are a company, you have got these carbon disclosure projects, all these things coming up where it is now kind of mandatory for you to disclose your climate risk, for example. So a lot of those forces kind of also enabling firms to achieve net zero by 2030 and 2040. It's challenge. It varies from industry to industry. But again, much more efforts are needed to meet those targets. 2030, it's just there. And we still have no clarity on things around, even, for example, where hydrogen is going to be used and where, other kind of energy sources, renewable energy sources is being used.
I would say next to zero chance, personally. That's a personal opinion, it's not a company.
But I'd just like to pick up Dunc's point, which is, it's not a so what, but if it wasn't difficult, then we shouldn't be doing it. It's just like, if it was easy, then we should be doing it by 2030, not by 2040. So I'm with Dunc.
If you look at the acceleration required from now to then, it's almost impossible to see, even with technology, it's impossible to see the acceleration. I think businesses are doing the right thing right now. I think everybody, but if you look, most people are talking about intensity If we strip out water and waste, which I think everyone's doing a pretty good job on, and just look at carbon emissions, everyone's got intensity targets, but most businesses are growing. So by the time you net out the growth from the intensity, you know, the absolute emissions are certainly not, I mean, maybe the people are flat or declining a bit, but to go to net zero, that step change is monumental. And I would suspect most businesses, when they start to stare in their scope 3 or back into the depths of vertical integration to farming and fertilizers, you know, are going to really struggle with how to get to net zero. But I mean, progress will be made. I just think it's to get to net zero by that day, I think will be tough.
And if I may, sort of, you know, from a Reckitt perspective, scopes 1 and 2, absolute reduction we will achieve. Scope 3 is the challenge, and that does require a greater enabling environment from a legislative point of view. You know, for example, you know, under the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, we modeled our business. And physical risks, so that's the risks of climate change, flood, storms, etc., that will impact our business due to the nature of our factories probably in 2040 onwards, if we continue to sort of pollute or the climate, the temperature rises at the current rate. So that is an immediate risk to us. The big risk, and this is the uncertainty around it, is around transition risk. And the primary risk there is a carbon price. If governments legislate and put a price of carbon in, which potentially can go up to $100 a tonne, that will completely transform what action businesses take in order to decarbonize. So I think a lot of us are, you know, building up internal carbon prices, which are a lot less, to help try to drive through internal capex on decarbonization. But I think that enabling environment from a policy perspective will be required in order to really drive that investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think also one of the key challenges is to understand that, as mentioned, managing, you know, in terms of net zero, is that what you can't go by doing is outsourcing your emission nowadays. Like, you know, majority, I mean, I talked to a company, leading telecom company, and they said, well, actually, we are net zero because we only have 2% of the emission, but what my supplier emit 85% of our emissions. So, you know, you may not have, you are a service-based business and you have very little emission, but then you have outsourced all your activities to external, you know, your suppliers in different countries, and then being able to, so those things are changing, and it will be unfair, I think, for
most carbon, you know, the disclosure projects and things, they don't allow you to do that. Yeah. So, you know, you can't get away with that anymore. It's all part of your whole carbon emissions, you know, commitment. You know, and I think individual businesses will get there. I mean, I'm actually pretty sure we'll get quite close to net zero. But I'm talking about the normative, the system. Yeah. You know, I think individually, you know, you can see some ways of getting there. But I think the normative, the whole global ecosystem. You know, if you look at the number of trees you have to plant just to offset things, you know, it's almost growing the size of the Amazon, you know, every 5 years.
I have got a last question to ask, which is to understand the role of technology. I mean, nowadays in academia and research, we look at whole range of technologies varying from big data to digital twins to all these complicated models. What do you see the role of technology to achieve these net zero, as well as, you know, supporting risk and resilience and managing risk in supply chain?
I think from my perspective, technology plays an important part, but it isn't the golden, the silver bullet. It really isn't. You know, a lot of people have been talking about blockchain and, you know, how that's going to really drive visibility in supply chains. But at the end of the day, you know, crap data in, crap data out. So I think it's getting the balance right between understanding how we can leverage our own personal networks and internal processes to address some of these challenges, and then how technology can enhance that. Because if we take supply chain traceability as an example, a lot of that actually begins with just you and the individual buyers engaging with the suppliers and asking the right questions, and asking them to disclose certain pieces of information for them. Technology can just help make that process a lot more efficient and automate part of that. So I think I think it has an important role to play, but it is not the silver bullet, really.
Any complementary thought, Dunc?
I mean, I think technology's definitely got a part to play in both the activities. You know, I mean, my time back in Pepsico, you know, technology was a real initial step forward in, you know, saving water, reducing energy. But I think most of the benefits that people are seeing right now are good old-fashioned, you know, process improvements and, you know, people capability. You know, I think technology is complementary rather than leading in this respect.
Yeah, I think what you'll see is, technology providing some help with some breakthroughs. So talked about hydrogen. So how does hydrogen suddenly become? And there's some technological things that will enable that, but it's in and of itself it won't be enough. As is always the case with this, it's multifaceted. Technology has a role to play, but we talked a lot about governments. They have a massive role to play, massive role, and a role that should make us feel uncomfortable. That seems strange to say that as a shareholder as well as an employee, but they need to make us feel uncomfortable because that will force the system to do the right things.
Perhaps one last add from my side. I mentioned that I have a group that is doing sustainability by design and engineering. I'm saying that because what we try to do is not supposed to be incremental. If you think about us as a company that fries, yeah. So we have a frying technology. We use gas, yeah. We need to get rid of gas. That's a big technology step that we need to make, and we're trying to do that, yeah. So if we now put new equipment in place, it's going to use something like 15% less gas, yeah. Does that solve the whole equation? No, it doesn't, but it is a substantial step. Another example, precision agriculture. I mentioned you used the word fertilizers. In today's reality, more and more we're going to see that what farming is precision agriculture. It matters a whole lot where you apply fertilizers and how you do that in an efficient way and what time of the year and how you take account of weather changes and you apply it at the right point in time. So that whole precision agriculture with drones on the field, all that stuff is going to make another big step. Again, not enough to change the game, but all those things together need to make a difference. So my word would be, yes, we need technology. We need it massively.
Thank you. I'll just take any final question or any final thought anybody may have from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, just a final question for the audience, for the panel. You've talked a lot about the, I guess, structural sustainability, the procurement organization. What are your thoughts, or what are you doing in your organizations about how do you incorporate sustainability into the operational day-to-day planning? So instead of just trying to optimize cost, service, and inventory, actually trying to optimize cost, service, inventory, and sustainability into those day-to-day decisions, because that's where the greatest sustainability savings are going to be realized.
I'm not wishing to sound glib at all, but if you run your operation efficiently, which is balancing those things, you'll have a much bigger impact than you think on driving a much more sustainable, system. I guarantee that. You run a good factory, you run a good supply chain, you'll see the impact significantly. Now, that's of itself, that's not going to be enough, but it has to be the start point, which is get good at what you do every day, and you will drive the benefit. Then I think the flip is, what are the changes you need to make to your portfolio, to the way that you run your business model, that you can then integrate into that smoothly running system. So I think those two things have to go hand in hand.
I think I'm not sure I'd agree with the last part of your statement, which is it's the biggest opportunity. It's an opportunity, and I think Paul's right. Simply again focusing on good basics in operations will drive best performance and will then impact that. One significant change you can make, and it's something that I've done in our business. I run R&D, part of supply chain R&D and innovation. So most people have got a stage gate process for a new innovation. We've now introduced a sustainability matrix for each piece of new innovation coming on, and each piece of new innovation has to be better than its predecessor. So it won't go through the stage gate process now, whether it's a label, a cap, a bottle, route to market innovation. If it doesn't improve the metrics, it gets rejected. So that's probably our biggest opportunity.
I think, again, from the perspective that we come from, we look at perhaps a number of companies from across the globe. And increasingly, we see that companies are taking into account the risk factor, the net zero factor into their operational decisions and supply chain decisions, whether it is going about selecting your suppliers through to inventory decisions, through to even designing your network. So there are increasing push towards that, and of course, technology is helping companies to do that.
Very briefly, I think we're looking at the entire value chain around this. So a lot of it starts with the sort of product footprinting, looking at carbon and water. How do we innovate products that use less carbon and use less water? The second piece is we then look at our factories. Where are they located? If we're making Dettol liquid soap, let's make sure we're not putting a factory in a water-scarce region. Okay? So it's about being clever around what is that factory going to produce, what resources does it need, and are we putting it in the right location and close to the market? Because we shouldn't be shipping bottles of water all around the world to this factory to be processed here and then here. It's madness. That also drives cost control as well. So as Paul said, managing your factory well and having that more strategic view in terms of how they operate, key. And then finally is around consumer engagement. How do we educate consumers around using our products and solutions in a different way that then reduces the impact that they have. So if we take Finish as an example, a lot of the work we're doing is around educating consumers that they they don't need to pre-rinse their plates before putting it in the dishwasher. That saves a huge amount of water. So I think we're looking at the entire value chain and then working with functions within it to integrate that sustainability lens, but more to do.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think we are literally running out of time, and I really encourage, this is a conversation which we can talk all days. So I definitely encourage you guys to please pick the panels and colleagues to have and continue this debate going forward throughout the day. Thank you very much for your time.